orb I filmed. His eyes. Anyways. So there's the eyes. You see the eyes? You can see the white of the eyes. You can see the eyelids, eyebrow. You can see the pointed nose. And it's got a mouth right here. Whatever it's worth. I think it's awesome. Anyways, back to the Journeys Out of the Body by Robert Monroe. We are now at Chapter 7, Post Mortem. Any acknowledgement of the existence of the second body immediately demands the question mankind has pondered since the day he learned to think. Do we live on? Is there life beyond the grave? Our religions say, believe, have faith. This is not quite enough for the syllogistic thinker who thinks valid premises that are clear-cut, leading to an inescapable conclusion. All I can do is be as reportorial and an objective as one can be in a basically subjective experience. Perhaps my premises will be valid to you as you read them. I first met Dr. Richard Gordon in 1942 in New York. He was an MB, a specialist in internal medicine. We became friends and he became our family doctor. He had a very successful practice built up over the years and possessed a rare clinical sarcastic sense of humor. He was a down-to-earth realist with the wisdom of experience. He was in his 50s when we first met, so I never knew him as a young man. He was short and thin, with straight white hair and tending to baldness. Mr. Gordon had two conspicuous manners. He had decided to live a long time, evidently, so paced himself very carefully. He walked deliberately in a slow, careful stride. He hurried only when absolutely necessary. More correctly, he strolled when he walked with steady casualness. Second, when someone visited him in his office, he would glance out from the inner doorway and stare intently. He didn't say hello, nor nod or wave. He simply stared as if he were saying, now what in the hell's the matter with him? Without ever having spoke of it, Dr. Gordon and I had a very warm and close rapport. It was one of those things that happened without explanation, so no logical reason. We had not too much in common other than the fact of going through a life experience at nearly the same moment in history. In the spring of 1961, I visited Dr. Gordon at his office and had lunch with him there and cooked over at Bunsen burner by his longtime nurse. He looked tired and preoccupied, and I commented about it. I haven't been feeling too well, he replied, and then flared up into his usual self. What's the matter? Can't a doctor get sick once in a while? I laughed and suggested he do something about it. such as seeing his family physician. I will, he said absently, then backed up to his normal self. But first, I'm going to Europe. I said, that sounds fine. Already have the tickets, he went on. We're gone a number of times before, but this time I want to see a lot of the places we missed. You ever been to Greece or Turkey, Spain, Portugal, Egypt? I said, no. Well, you ought to, he said, pushing his food away. Go when you have a chance. You won't want to miss seeing places like that. I'm not going to miss my chance. I said I would do my best, but that I didn't have a fat practice that would wait around for me to return. But he was serious again. Bob? I waited for him to continue. I don't like the way I feel, he said carefully. I don't like that. Why don't you and your wife come to Europe with us? I wish we had. Dr. Gordon and his wife sailed to Spain a week or so later. There was no word, so I assumed they were sunning themselves somewhere in the Mediterranean. 6 weeks later, Mrs. Gordon phoned. The doctor had taken sick in Europe, and they had to cut the trip short. He had refused treatment overseas and had insisted that they return home instead. He had been in great pain and had gone immediately into the hospital for exploratory operation. I was unable to see him in the hospital, but I was kept informed of his condition by his wife. The exploratory operation was a success. They found what they were looking for, an abdominal cancer. Beyond treatment, nothing more could be done but to make him as comfortable as possible. He would never leave the hospital, alive, that is, or actually physically alive. With this news, I felt I must find some way to see Dr. Gordon. It was all quite clear now, as most things are in retrospect. I am sure he knew of his condition the day in his office. After all, he was an internalist. He certainly could have read the signs and symptoms in his own very personal laboratory. That was the reason for the sudden trip to Europe. He definitely wasn't going to miss the last chance, and he didn't. The need to talk with Dr. Gordon seemed urgent. All in our conversations, I had never mentioned my wild talent or what I had been going through. I think I was afraid he would have thrown back his head and laughed, and then sent me to his psychiatrist's son. Now it was different. He was facing something where perhaps I could help him for a change. I didn't know how. What I had gone through could help, but I had a deep conviction that it would. I tried again and again to see Dr. Gordon, but only his wife was permitted in his room. I finally asked Mrs. Gordon to help me get in to see him. She explained that the doctor was in such pain that he was kept under deep sedation most of the time. Thus he was very rarely lucid and conscious. Usually he recognized her early in the morning, but evening this didn't happen every day. I told her that I had something important to tell him. I didn't elaborate. Even in her sorrow, she seemed to recognize that I intended to bring a message beyond that of a comforting son. The intuitive woman found a solution. Why don't you write him a letter? She suggested. I'll take it to him. I said I was afraid he wouldn't be able to read it. If you read it, she said, I'll read it. If you write it, she said, I will read it to him when he is conscious enough to understand it. And so that was what we did. She read it again and again to Dr. Gordon whenever he was conscious. She told me later that these repeated readings were at his request, not of her suggestion. Was there something in the letter you wanted to place firmly in his mind? When I heard this, I felt a great sense of regret. Perhaps he would not have leaned back and laughed after all. We might have shared much more if I had only gathered the courage to discuss my activities with him. Here are pertinent excerpts of the letter to Dr. Gordon. Quote, and you remember all the tests and examinations you gave me because you knew I was worried about something? Well, that was when it started. Now, as long as you are in the hospital for a while, you might just try it and find out for yourself. That way, you don't have to take my word for it. It will give you something to do while you recuperate. First, you have to accept the possibility, remote as it may be to your experience, that you can act, think, and exist without the restriction of the physical body. Don't tell your wife to send me to that psychiatrist son of yours. It takes more than Freud to solve this. Freud to solve this one, because he's making enough money as it is. In all our conversations, it didn't seem appropriate to bring up the subject, but as long as you're going to be tied down, give it some serious consideration. It might be useful later on. I hope you can discover a few things about it that I have passed over. It all depends upon whether you can also develop the ability to leave your physical body while loafing in the hospital bed. If so, you might find many ways that it can be helpful. It may be one way to ease the physical pain. I don't know. Give it a try. With all the sincerity I can muster, I urge you, Dick, to think about it. You will have passed a major milestone when you do no more than accept the idea that this second non-physical body of yours actually might exist. Once this has been achieved, your only other barrier is fear, and it need not be, because this is like being afraid of your shadow, of yourself. It is natural rather than strange. Get used to the idea that your lack of conscious experience with it does not necessarily mean it is something to be afraid of. Unknowns are feared only as long as they remain so. If you can hang on to this, you need not have fear. Then and only then, try the formula I have written here. I don't know the effect of any meditation you have been taking, a medication you have been taking. It may help or hinder the technique, but do give it a try. It may or may not work the first time. Most important, let me know how you're getting along with it. When you get better, perhaps I can drop over and discuss the whole thing in detail. I would have come now in person, but you know how cranky the hospital is about rules. If you tell your wife about any attempts, I'm sure she will relay them to me. but I would much rather hear them from you later on. Just let me know." And end of quote. Mr. Gordon did not let me know if he actually did try. I felt it entirely inappropriate to query her too specifically at the time. She was much too sadly overwrought with the knowledge that Dr. Gordon's condition was terminal. I still am not sure that she realized my letter could be construed as suggested training for death. Dr. Gordon dropped into a coma several weeks later. He died peacefully without regaining consciousness. For several months I thought about an attempt to go to Dr. Gordon or wherever he was. He was the first person close to me who had died since the development of my wild talent. I was both curious and objective. It was the first such opportunity. I was sure that Dr. Gordon wouldn't mind if he did continue to exist. Not knowing about such things, I decided he would probably need some rest before I interfered with whatever he was doing. Also, I needed to summon up some additional courage of my own. This was an experiment I hadn't tried before. It might be truly dangerous. Then on a Saturday afternoon, I made the attempt. It took about an hour to get into the vibrational state, and I finally swung out of the body, mentally yelling, "I want to see Dr. Gordon." After a moment, I started to move rapidly upward, and soon all I could see was a blur of motion and feel what seemed like a rush of very thin air. Also, I felt a hand under my left elbow. Somebody was helping me get there. After what seemed an endless journey, I suddenly stopped, or was halted. I was standing somewhat dazed in a large room. My impression was that it was an institution of some kind. The hand under my elbow moved me to an open door and stopped me just inside the door, where I could look into the adjoining room. A male voice spoke almost directly into my left ear. "If you stand right here, the doctor will see you in a minute." I nodded agreement and stood there waiting. A group of men were in the room. 3 or 4 were listening to a young man about 22 who was excitedly relating something to them, complete with gestures. I didn't see Dr. Gordon and kept expecting him to appear at any moment. The more I waited, the warmer I seemed to feel. Finally, I became so hot that I was extremely uncomfortable. I didn't know what was causing me to feel so hot. I wasn't sure I could stand it much longer. It actually felt as if streams of perspiration were running down my face. I knew that I couldn't stay much longer. I couldn't take the heat. If Dr. Gordon didn't appear soon, I would have to go back without seeing him. I turned and looked again at the group of men, thinking that perhaps I should ask them about Dr. Gordon. At just that moment, the short, thin young man with a big shock of hair stopped in the middle of his conversation and looked at me intently for a moment. After a simple short glance, he turned back to the other men and continued his animated discussion. The heat became unbearable, and I decided I had to leave. I couldn't wait for Dr. Gordon. Using a motion I had learned, I moved quickly upward and away from the room. It was a long journey back. After reintegrating, I checked my physical body. I felt cold, a little stiff, Certainly there were no streams of precipitation. Perspiration, running down my cheeks. Disappointed, I sat up and made notes of the trip. I had failed for some reason. I had not been able to find Dr. Gordon. Time away from the physical was 2 hours. There is a stubborn streak in my heredity. The following Saturday I tried again. Just at the moment I left the physical body and started to yell for Dr. Gordon, a voice spoke right beside me, almost irritated. Why do you want to see him again? You saw him last Saturday. I was so surprised that I dropped back into the physical almost instantly. I sat up and looked around the office. I sat up. Where was it? I just lost my. Okay. I was so surprised I dropped back into the physical almost instantly. I sat up and looked around the office. There was no one in the room. Everything was normal. I thought of trying again, but decided it was too late for another attempt that day. Last Saturday, there was nothing important about last Saturday. It hadn't worked. I went back through my notes for last Saturday, and there it was. The doctor will see you in a minute. And what could have been a minute later, a short, thin young man with a shock of hair had turned and looked at me intently. He had looked at me without saying a word, as if he were thinking. What I had noted was a perfect description of what Dr. Gordon would have been at 22 instead of 70. This seemed to lend more credence to the experience than anything else. I had expected to see a man of 70. I didn't recognize him because he was not what I expected. If I had suggested this as a hallucination, I conceivably would have met a 70-year-old Dr. Gordon. Later, at the visit to the home of Dr. Gordon's widow, I managed to see an old photo of Dr. Gordon when he was 22. Of course, I didn't tell Mrs. Gordon why I wanted to see the picture. It matched perfectly the man I saw, who saw me there. She also mentioned that at the age, he was very active and eager, always in a hurry, and had a big shock of blonde hair. Someday I will try again to visit Dr. Gordon. Another time, in anticipation of a move out of the state, we sold our home when a buyer suddenly came along. As temporary measure, we rented a house for a year prior to our move. It was an interesting place built on a pinnacle of rock directly over a small river. We rented it through an agent and never met or came in contact with the owner. My wife and I took the master bed, which was on the main floor. About a week after we moved, we went to bed and my wife fell asleep almost immediately. I lay there in semi-darkness and looked through the floor to the ceiling windows at the night sky. Without willing it, I felt the familiar vibrations begin, and wondered if it would be all right to let it happen in a new location. Our bed was positioned off the north wall. To the right of the bed, if you were lying down, was the door to the hall. To the left of the bed was a doorway into the master bathroom. I was just in the act of lifting out of the physical when I noticed something at the doorway. It was a white form the general size and shape of a person. Having become extremely cautious about strangers, I waited to see what would happen. The white form moved into the room, around the bed, and passed within a foot of my side of the bed as it went into the bathroom. I could see that it was a woman of medium height with dark straight hair and rather deep-set eyes. Not young, not old. She was in the bathroom only a few moments, then emerged and started around the bedroom again. I sat up non-physically, I'm sure, and reached out to touch her to see if I really could. Seeing the motion, she stopped and looked at me. When she spoke, I could hear her quite clearly. I could see the windows and draperies behind her and through her. "What are you going to do about the painting?" It was a woman's voice, and I could see her lips move. Not knowing what to say, I tried to give a satisfactory answer. I said I would take care of it, don't worry. With this, she smiled slightly. Then she reached out with both her hands and took my hands in hers, clasping my hands between both hers. The hands felt real, normally warm and alive. She gave my hand a little squeeze and gently dropped it, and moved around the bed and out the door. I waited, but she didn't return. I lay down and activated the physical, then slid out of bed. I went to the hall door and looked into the other rooms. There was no one there. I went through all the downstairs rooms and found nothing. Then I made out my notes and went back to bed and slept. A few days later, I met the psychiatrist who lived in the house next to us, and Dr. Samuel Kahn. I kept meeting psychiatrists this casually. I asked him if he had known the people who owned our house. Yes, I knew them quite well, Dr. Kahn said. Mrs. W. died about a year ago. After that, Mr. W. refused to go in the house and just moved out and didn't come back. I said it was too bad, that it was a fine house. Well, it was her house. You understand, Dr. Kahn replied. Matter of fact, she died right there in the house, in the room that you're sleeping in. I said, that was interesting. She must have liked the house very much. Oh, she did, he replied. Very fond of paintings. Had them hung all over the place. But the house was pretty much her whole life. I asked him if he had happened to have a photo of Mrs. W. Let me see. He thought for a moment. Why, yes. I think she was in a group picture taken at the club. I'll see if I can find it. Mr. Kahn came back a few minutes later. In his hand was a photo showing some 50 or 60 men and women, most of them simply as they stood in the row. Mr. Kahn studied the picture. She is here somewhere. Yes, I'm sure. I looked over his shoulder at the pictures, and his second row was a familiar face. I touched it with my finger and asked Dr. Kahn if that was Mrs. W. Oh, yes, that's Mrs. W. He looked at me curiously, then with the realization, oh, you must have found a picture of her in the house somewhere. I said, yes, that was it. Very casually, I asked him if Mrs. W. had any unusual mannerisms or the like. No, not that I can remember, he answered, but I'll think about it. There must have been something. I thanked him and started to leave. I turned when he called, "Wait a minute, there was one item," Dr. Kahn said. I asked what it is. Why, whenever she was happy and grateful, she took her hand in both of hers, palm and palm, and gave a little squeeze. Does that help? That helped. With experience, I became a little more convinced that I could take such chances in areas that were certainly unusual. A very close friend, Agnew Bonson, was about my age, and we had much in common. I had known him for about 8 years. He was a pilot, among other things, and flew frequently in his company plane. One of his research interests was anti-gravity, which we discussed many times. He had a laboratory where he conducted experiments in this field. Among matters we discussed relative to his gravity studies was the question of how one or even two people could demonstrate any effective results in anti-gravity in this age of massive research teams and extremely expensive instrumentation. On a business trip to New York in 1964, I found myself in my hotel room with an hour to spare in the afternoon. I decided to take a nap. I lay down in the bed and just had it started to drop off to sleep when I heard Mr. Boson's voice. There is a way to prove anti-gravity. All you have to do is to demonstrate it yourself. You have been trained to do it. I sat up and fully awake. I knew that what the voice was referring to, but I hadn't had the courage to try it. But why did Mr. Bonson's voice sound so real in the stream? I looked at the clock on my bed. It was just about 3:15. I was too wide awake now to sleep, so I got up and went out. When I returned home 2 days later, my wife was very quiet. I asked her what was wrong. "We didn't want to upset you with all you had to do in New York," she said, "but Agnew Benson is dead. He was killed trying to land his plane in a small field out in Ohio." I remembered Mr. Bonson's voice in New York. I asked her if he had been killed 2 days ago at around 3:15 in the afternoon. My wife looked at me in a long time before she said yes, that was when it happened. She didn't ask how I knew. She was past that long ago. I didn't make any attempt to go to Mr. Bonson for several months. I presumed without any known reason that he needed rest. It had something to do with the violent death, and I'm still not sure I was right. Finally, I grew impatient. On Sunday afternoon, I lay down with the deliberate intent of going to visit Mr. Bonson. After about an hour of preparation, I finally made it out of the physical. I began to travel rapidly through what seemed to be nothing but darkness. I was mentally shouting, "Agnew Bonson," again and again as I traveled. Suddenly I stopped was stopped. I was in a rather dark room. Someone was holding me very still in a standing position. After a moment of waiting, a cloud of white gas seemed to blow up through a small hole in the floor. The cloud took form, and some sense told me it was Mr. Bonson. Although I could not see him too well or identify his features, he spoke immediately in an excited and happy way. "Bob, you'll never believe all the things that have happened since I've been here." There was no more a signal from someone. The cloud of white gas lost its human form and seemed to recede back into the hole of floor. The hands on my elbows steered me away. I took off back to the physical. That is the way Mr. Bonson would have been. Too interested in new things and new experiences to waste time in the then and the past, just like Dr. Gordon. If it was self-induced hallucination, at least it was original. I have never read anything like it. Does that explain the time coincidence in New York, in the New York hotel room? There is one more. In 1964, my father died at the age of 82. Although I had been rebellious in early years against paternal authority, I felt quite close to my father in later years. I am sure he felt close to me. He had suffered a stroke several months before, which had left him almost completely paralyzed and incapable of speech. The latter was evidently most vexing, as it would naturally be to a man who was a linguist, whose life had been devoted to the study and teaching of languages. During this period, when I visited him, he made desperate, heart-rending attempts to speak to me, to tell me something. His eyes pleaded that I'd understand. Only slight moans came from his lips. I tried to comfort him, talk to him, he tried his best to answer. I couldn't tell if he even understood my words. My father died quietly in his sleep one afternoon. He had lived a full life, a successful one. His death brought mingling sadness and a sense of release. Again and again I have realized the importance of some of the down-to-earth beliefs and concepts that I have learned from my father. I will always be grateful. This time, with one very close to me, just recently dead, I had much less trepidation than before, or perhaps familiarity, at least a sense of it, bred a little less caution and more faith. One reason that I waited several months was one of convenience. Other pressing matters in my personal and business life seemed to prevent the necessary ability to relax. However, I woke up at about 3 a.m. on a weeknight and felt that I could try to visit my father. I went through my ritual. The vibrations came easily, swiftly. In a moment, I disengaged without effort and was up and free in the darkness. This time I didn't use the mental yell. I concentrated upon the personality of my father and reached to be where he was. I began to move rapidly through the darkness. I could see nothing, but there was the tremendous sense of motion, coupled with a pull of thick, liquid-like air rushing past my body. It is much like the feeling of plunging through a water after a dive. After a dive, suddenly I stopped, and I did not recall anyone stopping me this time, nor could I feel the hand on my elbow. I was in a dim room of large proportions. I seemed to know that this was like a hospital or a convalescent home, but no treatment as we know it was practiced here. I started to look around for my father and didn't know what to expect, but at least I looked forward to a joyful reunion. There were several small rooms off the main room where I stood. I looked into two of these, and each there were several people who paid little attention to me. I began to wonder if I had come to the wrong place. The third room was no larger than a monk's cell, with a small window about shoulder height in the wall opposite the door. There was a man leaning against the wall near the window, looking out. I saw only his back as I entered. Then he turned and saw me. His face registered utter astonishment, and my dead father spoke to me. "What are you doing here?" he said. This is exactly the manner a person would use who had traveled halfway around the world and then met someone who he had just said goodbye back home. I was too excited to speak. I just stood there, hoping for a joyful reunion. I had expected. It came immediately. My father reached forward, grabbed me under my armpits, and happily swung me high over his head and down again, just as I remembered so well as a small child, and just as most fathers have done with their small sons. He put me down on my feet again, and I was confident enough to speak. I asked him how he was feeling. "Much better now," he said. "The pain is gone." It was almost as if I had reminded him of something he wanted to forget. The energy seemed to drain out of him, and he turned away, appearing tired. As I watched him, he seemed to forget I was there. He looked thinner, about 50, based upon the pictures we have when he was that age. I sensed that the meeting was over. There could be no more for now. Quietly, I moved back out of the room, turned, and reached out and returned to the physical body. It took much less time to return than to go. Was it that way? Was the pain so intense in those last days when he couldn't make himself understood to get help to ease the pain? If that is true, what a terrible prison his body must have been. Yeah, imagine doing what I go through for 15 fucking years. It's 14 fucking MS. Death is indeed a blessing. Will I try to see him again? I don't know. I don't know if I should. There are many other experiences less personal, but equally impressive. They all led me to an inescapable empirical conclusion, which alone justified the many hours of anguish, uncertainty, fear, loneliness, and disillusion, which was a point of embarkation on what some call the quantum jump in thinking and the beginning of a new point of view and perspective, which permitted the pains and the pleasures of the here and now to drop into their proper category of importance. What is a minute, hour, or a year in an infinity of existence, which opened the doorway to a reality that may ultimately prove incomprehensible to the conscious human mind, yet will continue to tantalize the curious and indiscriminate, the intellectual. Is this my answer? Upon these experiences, with the knowledge that the human personality can and does operate away from the physical body, there can be but one. If there is to be a great message herein, this may suffice. And the point being, this was life after death. That's in chapter 7.